process changes. Change from, you know, small things like staff to locations to big things, like I said, you know, where there's mergers or acquisitions. So any framework, any governance, risk, or compliance framework like DPA or ISO or any of these other frameworks, they are built on your ability to identify and address that change, and therefore address the associated risk, any associated with risk with that change. So that's key. And for us in data protection, that's the only place to go. That is the purpose of the DPIA, of the Data Protection Impact Assessment. Anyway, our approach to consultancy is to think a little more deeply and question assumptions, question the risk assumptions, and this is why we embrace things and what we find as truisms like change is the only constant, and we look for things like cause and effect, and turn to help our clients measure things in measurable results, things that we can put our arms around and say we've made a difference, we've minimized that risk to an acceptable level. Anyway, you're going to hear these themes in any presentation, any webinar that we do, because this is our DNA. But today's like we said, it's almost, we find it's somewhat redundant, because you're not redundant to other compliance frameworks, but your ability to identify and address change is critical for whether it's compliance, but in general risk management. And like I said, DPIAs are the tools for that. We want to give you a little insight. We're going to talk about the purpose. Well, sorry, I'm looking at. Let me introduce myself. For those of you who know Risk Crew, you've probably seen my old long tooth, long enough. Good news is I'm getting. Bad news is I'm getting old. The good news is I still got my hair, so I got that going for me. But I've been doing this for about 20 years, and any webinar that you see is probably the essence of what we here at Risk Crew try to boil down to the essence of the issue. But I've had a perspective on data protection since 1998. The original UK data protection, and the GDPR, and now our new DPA 2018. Is all in a stream of a long story for me. But Andy, so I was going to act as the MC, kind of kick us off, steer us in the right direction, and turn it over to Andy. And Andy here at the Risk Crew is our go-to guy for specifically for DPA, GDPR compliance. He's got over 15 years of actually doing this, filling out DPIAs and helping and assisting our clients understanding what are the risks, how can you manage them to an acceptable level and move on. So Andy's going to deliver the bulk of this. I'm along for comic effect. I'm along for levity and distraction. I'm the song and dance guy. If there were a difference, it's like I'm the Barry Manilow and Andy's the Bob Dylan. That gives you a musical reference to work by. And you got to see Andy's hair. This is an old picture of Andy, and he's been working from home for, geez, what is it now, Andy, in the last year? So he's his hair looks better than mine, man, in terms of what we're proud of. Anyway, I'll kick us off and then turn it over to Andy. What are we going to talk about today? We're going to talk about what's a DPIA. All right, what's the requirement, which I'm sure all of us who are all of you listening are well aware of. But the template, the general template, as in what's the process in the template that needs to be executed. And then I'm going to hand it over to Andy, and Andy's going to pick up what are the triggers you should look for to be able to initiate and know when the alarm bells go off and when you should start doing a DPIA. But what your focus is, what's the ultimate objective of any DPIA, and what skills, experience, any kind of tool sets that you should have or look to have if you need to execute one. But then again, we're all about the essentials. What's crucial in executing a DPIA that's going to stand up and that's going to last and make real value to your compliance effort. And Andy will walk us also through some simple mistakes to avoid, mistakes he's seen, mistakes our clients have made, and mistakes that he's seen over his 15 years. But then we'll turn over into, after you finished it, what's next? What do you do after you do a DPI, and have a short conversation on that. But I should say, you guys who know me can clearly see I've had 3 cups of coffee today. So, somebody throw up your hand if you need me to slow down. But what I should say is one of the hardest things to do in a webinar is make sure that we can address any questions that you might have that come up, whether it's if it's a specific hands-on case study thing that you'd like to get Andy or myself to answer. Throw it in. Absolutely submit a question, and we'll see if we can address questions while Andy's working through the material, but also at any time. After we've got some, we left a couple minutes in case you do have some questions, because, well, we think at the end of the day, it's one thing for us to talk about it. It's another thing for us to translate that and give you some responses. So we got some Q's and we got some A's, and hopefully in that order. Okay, so talked about change. We talked about the only constant in cyber is change. And so in terms of our definition, we start here. One of the things I did, I told you we always question assumptions, and I'm big on that. I think I understand what a DPIA is, and it's odd that, because one of the first things I did about a week ago when Andy and I were putting the material together is I thought, I know what it is. I know exactly what it is. I've had X number of years, but I Googled definition DPIA, and you know what? I found 4, 5, 6 different definitions. And obviously I stick to the definition of the ISO, but the only thing that when I found different, and you get vendors, but I saw that different organizations tend to identify the definition or define what a DPIA is differently. The ISO's got a definition up there, but that's not the one that I see floating around the industry. So, in terms of, let's start at the basics. Let's start at what a DPIA means. Yes, it stands for Data Protection Impact Assessment. And I tell you, what I did is find the only similarity between definitions out there were the words identifying, minimizing risks to data. Okay, and to guys like me and Andy, that's a risk assessment. It's basically a risk assessment tool. All right, identify, minimize, and manage the risk to data. What data in terms of DPIA or in DPA? It's personal and sensitive personal data. All right, but so a DPIA is this process of can I identify the threats to this data, the threats to the privacy of this data? Can I minimize that? I've added the word document in there because, one of the biggest mistakes that we see is everybody's identifying, minimizing, but the accountability for me is one of the biggest outcomes of a DPIA is to get registered, like a risk register. You've identified this, you've minimized this, and you've documented that and have a historical record. And for me, that's one of the definitions of this, is not just to identify and minimize, but keep a running log. And this is also what we're not seeing, or is a basic oversight in the industry. Okay, but at the end of the day, it answers those simple questions: is what am I trying to protect? Is it SPII? Where is it located? That's simple. Can you answer that? Where is it located? And this is what we see in terms of getting us to push over to draft up data flow diagrams. Do I even know the data that I have? And that's an integral part of what a DPIA is. And then what am I trying to protect it from? What is this event, all right, that can have a potential adverse impact on the data? And what am I going to do about it? What am I trying to protect? Where is it? What am I trying to protect it from? And what am I going to do about it? And as I said, these are all the basic elements of any risk assessment. This is Risk Assessment 101 that I've been doing I think I did my first one when I was 12, when I did a risk assessment about I was thinking about crossing the street, not in the crosswalk, but that's what it is. That's what it is. And as such, it's got to be seen. It's a key part of what we're trying to do. What you're trying to do is everything changes, and to address the adverse impact of any change, we've got to keep our eye on and understand the risks. Okay, so any template that you see out there, and I have to say, I'm not a strong advocate of what the ISO does, because it's not clearly a risk assessment, and it's a consideration of the environment. It's a consideration, but for me, whenever I look at a DPI, I know that what I have to get out of it is identify what do I have, what are the threats to it, what am I going to do to minimize it, and that risk assessment. So the process, but the process that goes on in any DPIA template is very, very simple. You've identified, the asset, you've identified, and the need for why am I doing this? What is the change, essentially? What change precipitated me to assess what are the potential risks for this change? Is it a change in temperature? Is it a change in technology? Is it a change in threats, or is it a change in risks, whether that's a project or any new business endeavor, mergers and acquisitions? What kicked off the change? One of the, and I tell you, and if this is, we talked about the value of this on the understanding and embracing change and the risk associated with changes. One of the very first things that we've seen is, the pandemic. I mean, if that was not an unforeseen change, I don't know what is. That proved the rule that change is constant. Who among us anticipated a worldwide pandemic that's had the impact that it has? That's clear. But at the end of the day, I'm also, I also say, when I'm talking to clients, Andy's talking to clients, and one of the first things we ask is, did you do a DPIA on your sudden change in the way you work? Your staff's now 50, 60, 70, 90% working from home. Have you assessed the risks in that? Well, no, that's information security risk. But in fact, that's the quintessential. That is the ultimate change. So identifying the need for change, to identify the need for, do I need to, why am I conducting this? That's why am I, what change has triggered this this new assessment? Why is this assessment needed? That's got to be, that's square one. The second purpose is, all right, what am I currently doing? How's the data currently processed? All right, and then what's changed to that, and why has it changed? And then what's the volume, the sensitivity, the location, all of that comes in this, giving it scope and context, giving it background, giving it, so you can better understand the impact, the potential impact. What's the relationship to the, of the data to the data subject? Clearly in this stage, you should start to understand, what would the data subject expect me to do, expect us to do to protect their data? Did the data subject even envision us using his or her data like in this format? So why the change? And of course, is a change that benefited the data subject, or did we do this for the business? This for me is and it's an integral part. It sets the scene. It gives this thing process. It gives this thing scope, context, and the purpose. The purpose for what one instituted the change and what you're going to do about it. All right. The third thing is this: how are you interacting? What stakeholders did you talk to? Who was consulted for this assessment and why? IT, HR, my data processor. Who was involved in assessing the risk and understanding the change and the implications associated with that change. And then, of course, we move from there. Once you have the stakeholders and who's involved in this hot tub, assessment, then you move to to look at the necessity and the proportionality. And by that, you go back to why did we collect this data in the first place? What was our lawful purpose for data collection? Okay, and in this change, will we continue to meet those obligations? Does our processing still achieve this purpose? It answers that. How much is enough? Okay, and then we get down to as Americans like to call it, the meat and potatoes. That this is what we came here for. You've got to extend the process and start to identify what are the risks to this data. Okay, so this is the risk assessment part. What are the risks to the data? And then calculate what's the likelihood of harm, what's the impact of that harm, and then understand what is essentially an inherent risk state. As currently operating in this change, there is this currently unaddressed risk. This is the likelihood, this is the impact, this is the risk, low, medium, high, extra, crispy, however your classification scheme. But that's it. That's what it all comes down to, is what are the risks given the change, given the event, and what's the likelihood and the potential impact of those risks. So you're looking at what a severity level of and start to understand what control that you're going to put in there to remediate that, which is the next thing. Then you identify the controls you're looking at the inherent risk, and you understand that to remediate it to a level to minimize that to an acceptable level, something that is acceptable for the data owner and the business, you're going to do X. You're going to put encryption. You're going to put in dual authentication, whatever that is. But what's critical in this phase, obviously, is the acceptance by the data owner that that is acceptable risk. And so this sign off that comes up through you've assessed the risk, low, medium, or high. You've decided to minimize that risk to a more acceptable level, and you have a data owner that signs off on it. That's the crux of what's going on in a DPIA and how critical that is to sign and record the outcomes, that you've got the data owner and the acting DPO. And of course, if you as a DPO disagree with that, you've got, okay, the data owner's accepted this risk, but I find it to be unacceptable, and you've got a record. It becomes the institutional memory of how you've addressed change and the associated risks and the risks associated with that change. Okay, you can find this in any way, shape, or form. The ICOs, for me, gives it a lot of context. It's very good in terms of why the change. But for me, it's kind of, if it's light in any way, it's light in this number 5, is actually identifying the likelihood and impact. And if you haven't done that before, the process could be misleading, or you could underestimate how much assessment that really takes. Okay, that's my coffee talking. Andy, why don't you walk us through what would trigger out a DPIA? What are some of the alarm bells that would say this is the reasons to do a DPIA?
Certainly. I mean, for triggers. Well, basically, the main trigger is anything new that the organization is doing that involves processing of data and the storing or transmittal of personally identifiable information. But basically, any data processing that comes on that's new, the first sort of step of a DPIA is to identify whether or not that processing contains personally identifiable information. If it doesn't, that's good. DPIA finished, you can move on. But if it does, then you do the rest of the DPIA. So when we're talking about change, there's anything new, but anything that changes in the operating environment of existing processes. And that change may involve people. Many working practices are dependent on people that have introduced them and manage it. It may be around the technology, new technologies being introduced, which then changes the risk profile of the processing environment. But it could also be involved with a business process. If the organization has been reorganized, you may well have different business units taking over the processing. So a change is basically anything: people, business processes, technology. Any changes to existing processing environments should trigger a DPIA. So thing to bear in mind is that those triggers also apply to any data processors that you employ to process the data on your behalf. And the contracts you have with those data processors should also factor in the fact that they have to inform you when there's been any material changes in that processing environment, and you need to be aware of. Again, because you need those triggers to start a DPIA because something's changed. And if your processor is not telling you, then you're operating blind, and that is unacceptable.
Yeah, Andy, that's an excellent point and an unsung point. Are your DPOs actually, that would be a great way to benchmark your DPO's attention to their program, is ask them for a list of all the DPIAs they've done in the last 6 months, year. But you're absolutely right. This is not just, one of the triggers. You have to go out and look for that trigger.
Yep, absolutely. Can we have the next slide, please, Richard? So what are the objectives then of a DPIA? Well, once you understand the nature of the data that you're processing, the objective really is to identify and manage the risks. All processing of personally identifiable information has inherent risks associated with it. And the DPIA is a really critical tool in sort of understanding those risks. And looking at giving you options of, now that you identified the risk, what can you do about them? How do you mitigate them? Of course, the objective is to make sure that the data remains protected. That's a paramount thing. That's the chief objective, as it were. The overriding one is the protection of that data. But the DPIA forces people to take the data protection seriously, because people are going to be held accountable for it. The completed form, and if we use the template from the ICO, it puts names against the information that you're being given. So their names are going on record. People are going to be accountable. And of course, it's also providing you a documentation set. It's documentary evidence that you're following the processes enshrined in the Data Protection Act and GDPR before it. So it's there. It's your documentation of a duty of care to the data. And it shows that you're taking it seriously and following all the right processes. Can we have the next slide, please, Richard?
It's what I live for, Andy. You know that. Before I let you go, Andy's absolutely right here. This duty of care, this is due diligence. In the event that you had a breach, you've got documentation that you've understood, you know, the risk associated with this, and this is how you addressed it. Now that works both ways, because it becomes this historical memory, this institutional memory of what you did and also what you didn't do. So a good, thorough DPIA is critical that you can demonstrate we understood the risks and this is what we did to manage them, and they become your evidence that we did the right thing at the time. We did the best we could possibly do. Now, like, you know, again, in the event that you have a breach, that's going to be your go-to document. If you can't demonstrate that you provided duty of care, as Andy says, then you're nowhere. Andy, I'm going to change the slide because that's what you asked for, not for my commentary.
Now, the new sort of legislation, and the DPIA requires a certain skill set. It needs experience and it needs tools to do this. And this is new for this sort of legislation. You didn't require this particular skill set in the old legislation, so it's a new factor. And why am I saying that? Well, DPIAs, you generally have to interview the stakeholders, the people involved in the processing, the management, but you need to know what to understand, or what information you need to get at to get a good picture of what the data is, why it's being processed, who it's being shared with, and what protection mechanisms are there in there, and then of course what risks are associated with that environment that you're processing it. And once you've got a identification of those risks, you then need to do a risk assessment. And risk assessments wasn't detailed to any great extent in the previous legislation. This is new. So having a background in risk assessment, I'd say, is really, really important in this. You need to know what to do. You need to be able to identify the risks, evaluate it in terms of its impact, and then look at what controls are available to you to mitigate or transfer that risk. You also have to have an appreciation of the system that it's being used to process the data. What is the environment? Is it in-house? Is it cloud? If it's cloud, whose cloud? What controls are in place? What controls are available for protecting that data? So, of course, you do need your data protection principles. You need to know them like the back of your hand. But you do need to know how to conduct risk assessments. One of the things that DPIAs are not tick box exercises. You have to have some intelligence there, because if anything happens and you get an outside person, the ICO, looking at your DPIAs, they will quickly detect where it's a tick box exercise. They will be looking for some intelligence in the information and the decisions being made on that information. I've also put in there project management, and the reason for that is that in complex processing environments, if you identify a particular risk and putting in the controls to mitigate that risk may not be a quick fix. it may take a lot of resource, expenditure, time to get it in place. So it has to be handled very much like a project. You can't sort of note it down and ask for it to be done and then forget about it for a year until you do your next review. You've got to be involved in the project to get those fixes applied. Now, if we look at the tools, nearly every client we've been to for this are using Excel in one way or another, either for recording the DPIAs and recording expected sort of review dates to them and any actions and things. But there is a selection of open source and commercial software out there that can be used to bring it all together, because you are building up a document library here, and some of the documents will be interconnected. So it's worthwhile looking at that. It all depends on the complexity of your processing environment and whether or not you're using data processors. If you are using data processors, then it's probably a good idea to look at some solutions out there to keep track of all the documents and where they originate from. Could we have the next slide, please, Richard?
Okay, it's always something with you, huh, Andy? Favor. Yeah, can I throw in one more thing, because that's what I do, Andy, is what we haven't talked about when we talk about minimizing the risk. Okay, and one of the hardest things for a DPO to do is, do they have a view? Do they have an understanding of what the actual risk appetite is for the business? Because when we talk about minimizing the risk to an acceptable risk level, that's the risk appetite. And more often than not, the DPO doesn't have view, doesn't have an understanding, this gut feel of what is the risk appetite of this business. And so, am I minimizing this to this acceptable risk? And they and the data owner come up to something that they think is acceptable, but may or may not be in line with the risk appetite with the business. And that's the key. And that's why this is crucial, that these two things connect, is that what we minimize it to is in line, it meets the risk appetite of the business. And yeah, that is a challenge for anybody to understand what the risk appetite is of business, much less a DPO. Sorry, Andy. I also, Andy, it wasn't just me. We had a question come in. How do you stop the organization from treating the DPIA like just a form filling exercise? Good question.
It's an exceptionally good question. And to be honest, it's a bit, there isn't one specific thing you could point at and say it's more than a form filling exercise. It's a requirement within the legislation to do DPIAs. And there's an assumption that you will do the DPIAs to the best of your abilities and with the resources you have available. Now, a form filling tick box exercise is not doing it to the best of your ability. The people doing it need to have the appropriate skill set and knowledge, certainly the knowledge of the data, what's happening to the data, who it be shared with. So you can cut corners on DPIAs, but if anything happens, and unfortunately we're seeing more and more data breaches, those DPIAs may become under scrutiny from an external auditor, either the IC or somebody acting on their behalf. It will become blatantly obvious that you've treated it as a tick box exercise, because it'll be just noting down the fact that everything's fine, good, there are no problems. And if all of your DPIAs read the same, there are no issues, there are no risks, there are nothing we need to do, something is not going to be, it's going to be hard to present that as an accurate picture of your environment.
I also think, Andy, that getting the data owner to sign off on the actual DPIA, the physical form, it transcends it, and it helps focus the mind of what did we actually do here. I know I'm signing something, but what am I actually signing? And it kind of gets the data owner's heart and mind pulled in with that signature, and therefore, for me, that's where it transcends the difference between we're just box checking. You can box check, but then sign here. And when you focus somebody, a data owner, to sign an assessment, the chances are they're going to reassess the assessment and make sure that they understand and give it the thought that it deserves. And we just had another incoming question in terms of my last comment. if the DPO is responsible for establishing the controls in line with the risk appetite, then how can their advice be overruled? And it can't be overruled. But the trick is, this is the challenge: is the DPO are they overruling a data owner because they would only overrule the data owner in the case that the data owner is recommending something that's not in line with the risk appetite established for the business. And so that's why it is crucial for that DPO understand it can quantify and work with the data owner to say, this is what we're going to do to mitigate that down to an acceptable level, is because they both understand what the appetite is. Now, if the data owner, one or the other, don't understand what the appetite is, then and only then will you have a situation where you might have a conflict. But it's the objective, it's both data owner and DPO's objective to remediate a risk to this data inside the appetite. So that's why this appetite, articulating the appetite and defining and having both parties know what that is crucial to a successful DPIA.
Yeah.
Andy, I'm going to move the slide. Ready?
Yep, absolutely.
Okay, here it comes. Here it comes.
So what are the essential actions of a DPIA? I'd say the very first one, once we've identified that the processing involves personally identifiable information, you have to involve the key stakeholders. There's no going back on this. You have to get their involvement because they can give you the business context and the full justification as to why this processing is happening and its importance to the business. Now, you need to identify the precise metrics on which to base the risk decisions. I need to make this quite strong. People need to understand what you're talking about. So you need to explain the risk metrics, how they work and what they mean. You have to look at things like likelihood. You'll have to look at things like the impact. And then once things have been put in place to address the particular risk, is there any residual risks remaining? And are they acceptable? Or do you have to do something else further down the line? So it's all about making sure everybody understands the terminology and how the risk identification, the risk process works. Now, some DPIAs may identify require changes to the processing or maybe change the processing environment. So when I say processing, you may be able to eliminate some of the particular data from there. So you don't need all of the personally identifiable information. You can get away with just a subset. But anything like that requires a business decision to implement. That's why you need the stakeholders. You're not going to get anywhere if your DPIA uncovers, I wouldn't say failings, but uncovers that action needs to be taken, and the business now has to commit resources, time, money to do that. You're not going to get it done unless the stakeholders have been involved along the line. As with any risk management process, though, the metrics have to be consistent and they have to be the same approach for every DPIA that you do. If you start changing it midway through and using different ways, you're just going to confuse people. People won't understand how this works because your approach is completely different. If you've got significant risks to the processing, which are going to take time and effort to implement, they should be identified to the corporate risk treatment plan. Because risk management is a joined up process throughout the organization. So anything you've identified here needs to go into the corporate risk treatment plan. So the appropriate resources can be made available, but also so it can be tracked, so it can be managed as part of the risk treatment plan. The other thing to do is to make sure that DPIA forms, ideally there should be some way of numbering them to make them unique, but they need to be filed because they provide a historical record of what you've done to evaluate the risks associated with that personally identifiable information you're processing. They provide the duty of care documentation. It's probably going to be the first thing that the IC or the auditors ask for. So It's essential that you do them. They are a requirement of the legislation. There's no getting out of it. And it's in everybody's interest to do it to the best of your abilities with the resources that you have.
These are all good points, Andy. I honestly can't remember the last time that I've seen usually we'll go in, take a look at if any DPIAs have been done, and then walk them over and see if we can find them on the general corporate risk register, and they're not. That's just a big disconnect, that the data protection seems to act in its own bubble, and the risks associated with security risks to personal data aren't brought over and understood under the umbrella of all the risks facing the corporate. And there seems to be these two risk registers, but they're not even registers. They seldom leave that form. They're a piece of paper that's filed away, and it's sitting there. And the risks that were identified and assessed and evaluated and accepted on that don't find their way, whether they're remediated risks or accepted risks, to a risk register. Yeah, that's a big void.
Could we have the next slide, please, Richard?
Anything. If there's anything I can do for you, Andy,
I am enjoying this.
I bet you are.
Simple mistakes to avoid. Yep, it's not educating your stakeholders on the requirements and the objectives on there. Everybody needs to be aware. I mean, the whole landscape and environment for data processing of personal information has changed, and it's changed quite dramatically. And it's slowly filtering through now, but there are fines to be had if you're not taking this seriously, and data breaches. You have to take due care with the data that's entrusted to you. So you have to educate everybody around so everybody knows what the terminology is and what the requirements are. The other one, which this is a big one, is underestimating changes. And I've seen this where simple changes, because they appear so simple, have not been followed through and not been fully investigated. For example, we've got a cloud-based system. The only change made to this processing environment is a new report is being generated. They asked the DPO, and the DPO said, oh, that's fine. If they investigated a bit further, the final destination for that report was in a world-readable network share available to the entire world. If it's producing a report with all your personally identifiable information in there, that's a significant data breach, or from a very simple change, which everybody agreed to, because it's a simple change, nobody investigated to see what the details were. So don't sort of assume a simple change means nothing. Investigate it. To make no assumptions. We've also seen that people overestimate controls. There's a strong belief in sort of things like password strengths and things, but environments change, and especially if you've got split data processing environments, make sure the controls are consistent and enforceable and are doing what you expect them to do. And also a lack of accountability. This is a big thing, especially with new systems coming in. New systems generally have a project manager, and project managers are very good at delivering projects on time and on budget. The data processing, the DPIA aspect of it, is something they need to get through to deliver the projects. And depending on the complexity of the projects, there might be several DPIAs during the lifetime of that project, especially if it's going to take over a year or longer periods. The problem is the accountable person will disappear at the end of the project because the project manager is now off to a different project. Who's going to be accountable now? Who's it been handed over to? Are they willing to be accountable? Has anybody told them they're going to be accountable? And the other thing with DPIAs is you'd be surprised at how many organizations have yet to do one. And the reason for that is because of the skill sets and experience required to do them correctly. They can be a bit foreboding. A lot of people will look at it and think, well, I've got other things to do. I'll get round to them later on. And of course they don't. There are lots of things a DPO needs to do, but DPIAs need to be done, and you can't keep putting them off. There are very good reasons why you shouldn't put them off. And we'll cover that in the next slide. Could we have the next slide, please, Richard?
I'm sorry, Andy. I was distracted. Can I just add, yeah, Andy, but as usual, I've always got something to say. You know, for me, one of the fundamental mistakes to avoid is the data subject's expectations. I'm often shocked how we seem to approach data protection as a governance framework, which it is, but not understand this is not ones and zeros. This is the data about people's lives, you know, from their address to their medical records to their DNA. This is very sensitive. So I think one of the biggest mistakes we all make is to not consider what would the data subject want me to do, because that to me is a driving factor, and to personalize this and say, what if this were my data? Would I think this would be sufficient for the company? Does this meet my expectations? How I would think my data, my family's data, my wife, my husband, my grandmother's data should be handled. And I think that perspective is a mistake to omit from you conducting a DPIA.
Yeah, absolutely, Richard. One of the things I always recommend DPIAs do is treat it as though their family's data is in that data set.
Yeah.
How do you want it to be treated? Because that makes it personal. That gives it sort of context.
And when you make it personal, 9 times out of 10, and take on that perspective, you're going to make the right decision.
Yeah.
Andy, for that, I'm going to advance that slide for you for agreeing with me.
So what are the next steps? Well, it's a bit like the Forth Road Bridge. You get to the end and there's another DPIA to do. And that's quite rightly so. There will always be new DPIAs to do. Organizations, companies are not static. They're always evolving. There is always change. If they don't change, they'll go out of business. Simple as that. So you have to keep a log of all of the DPIAs that you do, and you should have potential review dates in there so you get round to reviewing them, because there may well be changes taking place which you're not aware of. And that brings me to another thing. People cause change, so educate your users. If your user is going to be setting up, let's say, a new SharePoint, because we've got new technologies coming along, which, well, they've been around for a while, but more people are using them now. SharePoint's a good one because Office 365, it's part of the package, and it's a very good way of sharing data internally and also externally. And it doesn't take much to set up a SharePoint site. So educate your users so that they understand that if they're going to be doing something new, which involves personally identifiable information, people's names, contact details, they have to fill in a DPIA form. And this could even be just a pre-DPIA form to let you know that they're going to start something. So it's a really good way of them triggering a DPIA to you, to let you know there's some processing going on and you need to be aware of it. So educate your users. Anybody who can create a new system or use existing tools for sharing data, processing data, let them know what their responsibilities are.
Good points, all. We've had a couple of questions come in. Timely enough, you just mentioned Microsoft 365. We had a question come in, said, we're looking at introducing Microsoft 365, and the product suite will process a vast amount of personal data. How can a DPIA on this be approached? Would you look at the categories of personal data, the components that make up 365, such as Word, Excel, or is there an alternative, more manageable approach?
I would always try and break it down into the business function, the business requirement that processing is trying to achieve. That there are various ways you can compartmentalize it. One of the reasons why I've mentioned SharePoint sites is one of our clients introduced a facility to allow people to set up SharePoint sites, and within a month they had 200. Not all of them included personally identifiable information, but the majority of them did. So they had to look at DPIAs and how to do it and how to take it through. And it ended up more or less as a training session for the people that wanted to set up the sites and what they needed to be aware of and how they needed to protect the data. And they then classed it into two groups, one that was purely internal and one that was sharing data externally, and looked at it that way. So it's a way of compartmentalizing and categorizing the various activities to see whether there's any commonality that you can include there.
I would agree, and also think that, first of all, if your business is going to 365 and you've got a information risk management system, that 365 should have been considered independent of DPA, and just what is the risk in general, so that you would get in step with the general security approach to 365. But at the end of the day, just like we had mentioned earlier, a lot of this is balancing volume and sensitivity. If it's a large volume of very little sensitivity, and there's risk in that. If it's a large value of very sensitive information, there's a risk in that. I'm finding 365 is it's on risk registers as an acceptable risk, meaning in general, the accountability for the data, the sensitivity, and the data volume is understood. And then in terms of likelihood and impact, security risk to 365, I'm finding I rarely do I find a 365 on a risk register that isn't acceptable. And if it's not acceptable, then there's access controls in terms of who accesses what folders that are executed, and dual authentication controls that you can put in. But in terms of breaking this down to what is the best approach, I'd start with the data sensitivity, and then I'd start with making sure that you're in step with any other security considerations being given or not being given to 365 for your organization. So then when you consider the sensitive personal data aspect of this and conducting a DPIA on the personal data for your compliance requirements, that you're inside the footprint of the risk appetite for the business. That accepted 365 in general, or accepted it with certain controls. But no, 365 I think is and there you go. First of all, good for you for understanding that our move to 365 will require DPIA, and we're not seeing that. I'm not seeing that. I don't know if you are, Andy, that people even get that change. That technology change, as you say. So suddenly, bang, we're going to 365. There should be a DPIA on record in addition to whatever's done on the risk treatment plan to justify to demonstrate that you've understood the risks.
Absolutely. And you have to identify what particular features of Office 365 you're using, and how the information there is going to be contained, processed, and shared. Once you understand that, then you can start to make decisions. But one of the things that I have noticed, that the most effective organizations around DPIAs and data protection itself, they have very much a culture of not blame at all, but they encourage the staff to report any sort of data breaches, or where they've been processing data but there hadn't been a DPIA. They're encouraged to do that simply so that the DPO can take the actions required to recover the situation, to bring things into line, and the organization moves on in a better position. You're not going to get that cooperation from the users if they're going to be fired for sending a wrong email. So they need to be able to understand that, yes, people will make data breaches, they will do things wrong, but give them the right training, give them encouragement, they report things, and you can see over trend what your weak areas are, whether or not you need to introduce additional measures, training, better awareness, or new technologies to stop data leakage, for example. So educating the users and having a culture of not blaming the users, but encouraging them to cooperate to you and inform you as the DPO of any processing they're aware of, or any that they've started. So that's
yep. Good point. Last question, I think we're maybe running out of time, and I'm paraphrasing the question, but I think I'm getting it correctly. Aren't DPIAs just required for large-scale processing of sensitive data and other risky processing activities? And they're citing Article 35 of the GDPR. Yes, the GDPR specifies large-scale and risky as in a minimum. But Andy, unless you have, my answer to this would be.
Well, I have a particular view.
Go ahead.
Until you've done
so do I.
Until you've identified the information and the processing that's associated with that information and the nature of the data, how do you know whether it's large scale and whether or not it includes any sensitive information?
It's risky.
Or it's risky. Yep.
Sorry, Andy, go ahead.
The thing is, unless you do a DPIA, if you try and cherry pick of which ones you're going to do, you're going to miss some. And you might miss the most critical one that has the data breach the next week.
If you don't assess all changes, you don't understand the risk associated with that. So you don't know if it's a small risk or a high risk processing change to processing activity. Yeah, for me, this is very much ignore it at your peril. If you just think, well, that it doesn't involve more than 100,000 records, and that's my idea of large scale processing. But the definition of what's large scale and what's risky and what's sensitive is on you to determine. And that's why also this is so critical that you establish a written record of your definition of those terms, of risk, your definition of processing of change in processes. So I think, and certainly we don't see that people are erring on the side of being conservative and conducting too many. I haven't seen that. And I'd throw this out there: how many of the listeners right now have actually conducted it and have a DPIA on file for the pandemic? That to me, and if you didn't see that as a change in processing that could have a huge risk implications, then I citing 3.6 Article 35 is in terms of, well, it hasn't changed our large scale. You do it at your peril is my and I've seen people under delivering them in general more than over delivering them. I think that's all we have time for. Andy, it was a pleasure to serve you and move your slides at your beck and call, to be at your beck and call and at your whim. If you have any other questions, though, we're coming to the end of our slide. This is where I thank Andy for his patience with my administration. I think we've got to most of the questions. We've gotten one or two, but we are running out of time, and we try to keep these inside of an hour. If we get a question from you, even right now at this time, we'll answer it and send you back an email. You've got our emails, mine, Andy's email, if you want to either ask for, explore, or you've got another question, or you've got another comment, a good joke, we always are up for that, or would like to argue a point, all up for it. But this is our contact information. Can I bother you before we sign off, because we've had so much fun? Can I ask you, right at the end of this survey, or at the end of this presentation, the webinar, we close with a little survey of 5 questions, and I'd really appreciate it if you could take all of 13 seconds, if you're a fast reader, to go through the questions and give us some quick yes, no. It just helps steer that we're putting together content that is of vague interest to the listeners. But if you could take some time and answer the survey questions, we can help keep us on track and make these webinars as beneficial as possible. But that's it. This is where I say thank you. Thanks for attending. Andy, thanks for that, wearing that summer shirt. That's just brightened up my day. I don't know where you are. I got a sweater on, and you look like you're about to go out and mow your lawn. Good for you. Thanks everybody for joining us, and please join us on our next webinar, and stay tuned for when that'll be. Cheers, everyone.
Thank you.
Enjoy your Wednesday.